Spoiler warning, this video contains major spoilers for the shown games and or films. It is highly recommended that you play or watch the game or film before watching this video. You have been warned.
Here's the sad truth. All men are not created equal. When I was 4 years old, I learned that some kids have more power than others.
Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD for short. It's something I've read a lot into and am far too familiar with it in my own life. It can hinder people on various different levels, and it isn't something to be taken lightly, so I want to begin this video by emphasizing the fact that the connections I make here are from my own personal experience of ASD, and anything I claim as fact are from the mouths of doctors I've talked to, or from trusted informational websites. You should also remember that every single case of individuals struggling with ASD differs. No one person is the same, but there are common attributes, just similar enough in various cases to be categorized into symptoms. And I'll say right off the bat, I'm no doctor, I'm no psychologist, some of these symptoms may be incorrect, and if they are, feel free to correct me in the comments down below. So again, I may be wrong, but this is from my experience and trusted sources. And I want to make it very clear that there will be no jokes about ASD in this video. No quips, no jabs, nothing. This is a very serious disorder, and I will be deleting any sort of comments that make fun of it down below. That out of the way, let's get into this discussion. Now, y'all may be wondering how on earth Izuku represents ASD, and, well, it's actually surprisingly clear. My name is Ghrei, and today I am here to explain how Izuku represents the autism spectrum in My Hero Academia. It seems relatively clear in just the first couple episodes that our protagonist has some level of ASD, or is at least meant to represent some point on the spectrum, so let's aim for the surface level symptoms to create a solid groundwork. And yes, I am aware he isn't on the spectrum canonically, but hopefully you'll see why I make this claim by the end of the video. Regardless, the most obvious connection is that boys are about 4 times more likely to be on the spectrum than girls. Additionally, a comparatively small portion of society has ASD. What does that sound like for My Hero Academia? Perhaps the proportionately small group of individuals who are born quirkless? Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. Just a little tidbit I noticed. Something else I've noticed is that Izuku has always kept silent at devastating emotional strikes while he was young. In situations where a typical child would break down into tears, Midoriya simply freezes and remains absolutely still and silent. This lack of response is actually something individuals with ASD commonly experience. Specifically, odd or unusual reactions to unfamiliar situations to them. However, while powerful negative emotions have caused Izuku to clam up and stand stark straight for a hot minute, powerful positive emotions have made him blast geysers of happy tears out of his eyeballs. A behavior he could have picked up from observing his mother. More on copied behavior later. His mumblings to himself could be seen as a sort of stim, or stimulating action. Another trait most individuals with ASD possess. Usually it's a physical thing, like tapping your fingers together or playing with your wrists, but verbal isn't unheard of. Heck, even his awkwardness around females despite growing up with a mother who clearly took good care of the lad and made him realize how the real world works shows that he just doesn't get the social conventions around females. As a brief side note, all of these examples, plus his actions in the anime, show that he's pretty low on the spectrum, pretty functional for someone with ASD, so we'll be rolling with that assumption for the remainder of this video. Perhaps the most prominent examples of his ASD, though, are only 3 in number, but are shown countless times throughout the runtime of the show. These are his hero analyses, including his notebooks, his overpowering desire to become a hero, and finally, his actions in combat. Let me explain. Let's talk about his hero analyses first. It's pretty clear from the first season's first episode that our freckled fighter will take any opportunity to learn about heroes nearby, how they use their quirks to further their careers, and how they approach various combat scenes. Now, this in itself is quite an interesting hobby for an individual to have, and you may even think that researching other people would seem quite boring. However, those who have ASD often rely on this sort of thing to properly integrate themselves into society. I know, personally, I have. In my experience, if I saw someone in a new experience I hadn't been in, I would, and still do, observe them as much as I could to see how you're supposed to approach it. For example, I still have no idea what I would do if someone would, say, ask me out. I've never seen anyone ask anyone else out except in movies, and I've never been asked out before, so I haven't the foggiest idea. For a more extreme example, a car crash. I've never been in or seen anyone in a car crash. The only thing I know is that you need to exchange insurance information? How do you approach the other person, though? Do you apologize first? Just hand them your insurance info and leave? What do you tell the people who are expecting you? The sheer act of having those hero analysis notebooks is an incredibly blatant, yet well thought out example of how individuals on the spectrum must deal with social situations. They observe, memorize, and then use that info in their own lives. Swap out the word hero for social and you've got yourself one hell of a compelling argument. However, this deep analysis inherent in many of those struggling with ASD leads us into another core aspect: pattern recognition, and in My Hero Academia, it's presented through combat above anything else. When Bakugo winds up observing Deku traveling across the pipe-riddled arena in a race, he notices his rival using moves identical to his. Earlier on, in their own fight at the mock battle, Katsuki's very first punch was used fully against him. Beyond that, upon discovering shoot style, Izuku doesn't begin private training. No. He asks Ida for help in fighting styles using his feet, and we actually see very similar combat choreography between the two. He even observes how he uses One For All for the very first time, then uses it the same way, shoved through his finger only, rather than his whole arm or leg this time, to impress Aizawa and rival Kachan's ball throw. Not only that, but perhaps the greatest example of this overanalysis is how, for the longest time, all Deku can think to do with his power is to replicate things All Might once did in his past of heroism. The closest Izuku gets to his own style of attack in this time before shoot style is a flick, which is literally as close to what he did in the ball throw as possible. He simply uses his own finger as a launching point instead of the surface of the ball. At every step of the way, our green-haired hero has copied combat abilities from others and applied them to his own tactics. How does this directly translate to ASD? Well, beyond what I described earlier as repeating actions in similar situations, for example, the sludge villain being blown back by All Might in the heat of the moment, and Todoroki's ice wall being blown back in a burst of panic, a parallel I never hear about enough, or at all for that matter. This is a great example of something identified as a common trait across the vast majority of the spectrum of ASD: pattern recognition. The ability to analyze something and see how it works, when it works, and effectively replicating it under similar or identical conditions. It's one of the few things many individuals deem as a sort of quote-unquote benefit to this mental condition. The way the brain is altered, mainly on the lower end of the spectrum, seems to massively enhance this ability in individuals. It obviously loops back into replicating and memorizing social events, seeing as those too could be seen as a variety of pattern. However, unlike any of the other heroes, it seems odd that Midoriya specifically would be the only student to copy others, doesn't it? All the people naturally born with abilities come up with their own moves, movements, and advancements. This was actually the major note I decided to cling to when coming up with this video. It just seems too coincidental to be a coincidence. But this isn't all there is to unpack. Beyond mimicking moves and observing heroes, Midoriya has one very important personality trait. More than anything else in the world, Izuku wants to be a hero. His drive for this is taken to quite an insane level, in fact, to the point of persevering in his goals even after the very individual he admired fully crushed his hopes by telling him he'd never be able to be a hero. This, although possibly being pure determination, is another common symptom of those along the spectrum. The obsession over a single topic, something that the individual will hold on to for a long time, possibly even their whole life. It makes sense now why Deku would be so gung-ho to put his life at risk for others with no plan, such as when he fights Muscular. He has no plan, no time to think while fighting the behemoth of an antagonist. He just fights! He fights because he needs to become a hero and can't think of any other way to do it. His brain isn't wired to let him focus on anything else. At least not like he can focus on heroism. If it wouldn't make the script too long, I'd even go into the fact that many of the low-end Nomus, and even a couple of the high-end ones, could be seen as individuals who are very high on the spectrum, and are forced into society. I could just keep going on and on. There's so much to cover. However, beyond all this evidence, outstretched to possibly even include all outcasts of society, but a fact I find fits best with ASD in my own personal experience is All Might. Specifically, his relationship with Deku and the message that it shares. A message that makes me feel choked up every single time. After all, I wouldn't make this video if the show didn't send a strong message alongside the implications of ASD and the main characters. All Might, much like Deku, was born without any superpowers. Another individual on the spectrum. While he did have a mentor in Nana who helped him integrate into hero work and shared her knowledge with him, there wasn't initially anyone who could support Deku. He walked around without knowing anyone else who was like him and felt entirely alone. That fateful day on the rooftop, when he asked his idol if he could succeed in his dream and was blatantly denied, it was a genuinely heartbreaking scene. Especially in hindsight, since someone who didn't have a quirk from birth but possessed one now told another who didn't have a quirk from birth and still didn't have a quirk that the heroic dream of the latter was impossible. Someone who was once in the same place you were, claiming you're never going to achieve your goal, even though they made it. But All Might saw himself in the young kid, saw how negligent he'd become, how passive he'd been to all the issues he once had, which were removed thanks to the help bestowed upon him by his mentor. He remembered what his mentor did for him, and thus realized just how horrible he had been to his fan. Hunting him down once the mess of the sludge villain was finally cleaned up, All Might told Midoriya that he had made a terrible mistake in shutting down the young boy's dream, in saying exactly what society had told him when he was in the same position. The world told him that if you aren't functioning the way that it needs you to, then you're useless. Both All Might and Deku were told this. But Nana saw past his hindrances and gifted All Might the abilities and knowledge to properly function in the world. In a single act of kindness, Nana put her foot in the door the world was closing on All Might and said, "I accept him, and someday you will too." And in the same act of kindness, All Might opened the door for Izuku. He gave our hero the chance to learn from someone who was in the same spot once before. Izuku feels he needs to work harder than anyone else because he's the outlier. His mentor has now given him the tools he needs to properly reside in the world that our freckled fighter was born into. Gave him the knowledge that he isn't alone, and gave us the message that even one person can change another's life. One individual's time and effort can help multiple generations of individuals who are struggling with something nobody else could comprehend. Depression and anxiety could be the target of this message. Hell, any mental illness or disorder could be considered to fit here, but autism? Autism is something nobody can truly comprehend unless they too lie on the spectrum. And the idea that the accumulated knowledge of those who fought through the adversity and alien nature of the world itself can help others whose warped perceptions, which are entirely out of their control, keep them from striding into their future? Well, it's a message that touches my heart in a way no other show has been able to. Thanks for watching. Y'all are beautiful people. You guys are amazing. You should feel amazing. And we'll see y'all in the next video. Goodbye.